All right, guys. Well, hey, I want to welcome everybody to this week's Facebook Live with SafeDefend. And Doug, unfortunately, we're going to jump right into it and talk about the tragedy that's occurred this week at Oxford High School up in Michigan, just outside of Detroit. Four dead, seven injured at last count that I saw. Um, just a real tragedy, and unfortunately highlights why SafeDefend's in existence, right? And walk us through that. I know there was a lot of the common things that we talk about all the time. Unfortunately, were on display again today. So let's talk about the first thing we always talk about. Let's talk about launch first of all, or excuse me, response time first of all. And I want to say this, Doug. This is not an indictment on law enforcement. I want to be very clear about that. It takes time once you're notified to get there. So nobody is saying that law enforcement did anything wrong here. That matter of fact, I think they did a fabulous job getting there as quick as they did. But Doug, I'll give it over to you.
Oh, thanks a lot, Phil. So one of the things that we want to look at, and as you just mentioned, the law enforcement response on this was, they showed tremendous valor. They ran into that building. They put their personal safety on the line, and that's exactly what we expect them to do. But we do have to look at what happened in this incident and find out what's going on with these type of incidents. A quick rundown on the timeline, according to Sheriff Grumbly, that the sheriff, that the Oakland County Sheriff, Grumbly was the suspect that was taken into custody. But the suspect walked into a bathroom at 12:50, and shortly after that came out and started shooting. The first 911 calls came, so that was at 12:50. The first 911 calls came in at 12:52, and officers responded with the school resource officer that was assigned to that school, and were able to take him into custody at 12:57. So 5 minutes after the 911 calls, they were able to get to the building and then take the suspect in custody. What we know, though, is that he had fired his first 20 shots in probably the first minute. So it was very, very quick of an ambush. And this is the type of thing that people don't understand all the time, is that there's a very, very, very short opportunity to actually intervene in these events most of the time. And so this is where, when we are relying on things like people to call 911 or people to try and call the front office to then relay the information of where the SRO needs to respond in an emergency, that doesn't work. And so one of the other things, too, is if you start scouring through all these news articles, you see that students were saying, I didn't know what was going on. I just heard somebody running down the hall saying active shooter, and I just took off. There were some students in the classroom said, we heard some popping noises. We didn't know if it was something hammering or something like that, and we didn't understand what was going on. And understand that that is what we have to break through. Is we have to sit there and say, how do we cut through all of this sort of chaos of the moment and get accurate information to law enforcement and to building occupants? And that's the type of thing that an alarm will do. When we look at this, the best example I can give you is that if there's a fire in any building in a school, the last thing you want is for people to sit there and try and call 911 or try and call the front office or try and relay where they're at in the building and all that. The reason we use a fire alarm, where all you do is pull down the fire station, is that the fire dispatch knows exactly where in the building that a device is located, and the firefighters know where to respond. And at the same time, it's simultaneously alerting everybody in that building that there's a threat and they need to take steps to protect themselves by evacuating the building. And so when we look at that, I don't understand why schools still think it's okay to have fire alarms, but in the event of an active shooter or some hostile intruder to the building, let's still, just call 911 and use word of mouth and hope that law enforcement gets there in time. That has shown to fail time and time and time again, but we keep going back to that same standard.
Now, help people understand this, because I think there's a misconception about resource officers also. In every school in America, those resource officers aren't in that building 24/7. They're not there the whole time. Sometimes I know in the community I live in, we have resource officers, but they're not always in that building. They're assigned to that building, and they'll have a presence at different times in that building. But police face a lot of challenges. That's why when people talk about defund the police, I roll my eyes, because one of the first things a lot of these people would be losing would be resource officers inside schools. I mean, it's just, many times they have to be pulled off for an hour or 2 hours or whatever to go cover something else and go do this or go do that. So it's not like they're sitting there patrolling the hallways the entire time these kids are in school. Is that not correct?
That is correct. Just to address the point of the school resource officers, and they do a great job. I'm not trying to, degrade them or saying that they're not
Right.
useful. What I'm just trying to do is address exactly what you're talking about is that
Right.
they are there for a limited window, but they're not always there. The best example that I always give is my daughter. She used to go to swim practice at 5:30 in the morning, and there were choir events on the same day that went till 10 o'clock at night. Well, that school resource officer usually showed up at 7:15 for the 7:40 school start time, and they were done by 3:15 that day. That's the typical situation, even though the school was still open. But the other thing too is that a lot of times with most school resource officers, we generally only have them in the high schools. So if there's something that's happening at one of the middle schools or the elementary, they might head over there to address problems that are happening in the school there. Some of the time it's, hey, we have a parent that's coming in that we've had some issues with. Can you have the officer come by just to be in the area? And they're like, great. So that means the officer is away from there. But if we also look at it, when we look at shootings like Marshall County, Kentucky, the school resource officer was directing traffic out front in the morning, in the early morning when the students showed up and started shooting people. Parkland, you had a 45-acre campus with 13 buildings, and the school resource officer was in the front office. That's very typical. Saugus High School in California, the school resource officer was on scene, but the shooter just went over to a courtyard and he just ambushed several students there. When Aztec, New Mexico, the school resource officer, I believe, wasn't in the building that day. When we look at Santa Fe, Texas, there were 2 school resource officers, but the school resource officers, this was kind of I think the shooting was in a separate part of this large Texas school, and they didn't know where the shooting was. They were just hearing reports of a shooting, and it took them a long time to figure out that it was over in the arts building. And so that's the type of stuff is that we, even though if they're on campus, these are such massive buildings. The most recent situation, I believe the shooting in Texas, where he shot 4 people and fled. That situation, the school resource officer, by the time he got up and figured out which classroom it was and got to that classroom, the shooter had fled from the second story, run through the building, got in his car in the parking lot, and fled the scene before the school resource officer even got to the classroom. And so what we have to say is, how do we cut down that response time?
Right, because we're put, we, like you said, resource officers do fabulous jobs, unbelievable jobs.
Right.
But it's almost like being, in the military, being dropped in the middle of the night into some third world country with no intel, no support. I mean, nothing. You're just dropped in, and they say, "Okay, good luck." I mean, and again, not pointing fingers at anybody, but we've got to find a fundamental. There's got to be a paradigm shift, I think, in how communities, parents, school boards, school administration, how we approach our politicians. And this is me speaking here. This isn't SafeDefend, but as a parent, we got to figure out a way to get our politicians to understand that this is a big enough deal that needs to be, I'm at a place, and I don't work for SafeDefend, but I believe in this. Being around you guys, I just believe in this. We got to figure out a way to where we mandate something to try to better prepare our administrators, our school teachers, our building site principals, give our resource officers better opportunity to be able to do their job. What are some ways that you think would facilitate that and could drive that?
Well, as you mentioned, school resource officers, they're not ubiquitous. They're not in all places at all times. And what people have to understand is a school resource officer is just one layer of a security posture that schools need to have. You have to look at what is it you're trying to address, because access controls and camera systems, those don't work for active shooter situations. The FBI tells us that 86% of school shooters are students, and another 10% are domestic partners, former employees, or disgruntled employees, things like that they're the ones that are committing it. It's only about 4% of school shooters have ever, attempted to come from the outside and get into the building. But the other thing that you have to look at is that what is it you're trying to address? And in an active shooter situation, notification is the primary objective in all cases. You have to get law enforcement notified that where they're needed in that building. You have to get everybody in that building notified that they need to take measures to protect themselves by either evacuating the building, barricading behind a closed door, or protecting themselves if they have to. But if you aren't dealing with those sort of priorities, you're never going to get to the point where you say, hey, we've got a good security profile. And so politicians have to understand that it's not a checkbox like, hey, do we have security? Yes, we do. Check. It's what layers do we have and what do each of those address? Cameras are really good for things like fights, bullying, vandalism, thefts, things like that. But cameras don't work to stop active shooters because most of them want the world to see what they did. They're actually something that they talk about. You'll see what I did tomorrow, and that's this kid. He actually did a videotape the night before. He didn't publicly put it out there, but supposedly one of the things he said was, "Everybody's going to see what I did." And so he knows that those cameras are there. It's not a deterrent. What's a deterrent is the idea that you show up with that gun, the school immediately goes on lockdown, and within seconds, the school resource officer or police are right there confronting the person, and there's no opportunity to actually commit the atrocity that they're trying to do. That's the deterrent we need to start looking for. But in these active shooter situations, if you don't have your notification down, and I'm not talking word of mouth, and I'm not talking about 911 calls, I'm saying that you have to have something very similar to a fire alarm that's a single stage, one-step process, and then all I have to do is protect myself.
Yeah, and again, to remind everybody, Doug's a career law enforcement officer, trained police officers for years. So this is a professional talking about these things, somebody that's, spent his life serving others in law enforcement. So I think that's very important. People understand this. This isn't theory. This is what we know to be fact.
And Phil, one of the things I want to talk about, and I think it's okay that people are calling 911, but if you actually listen, if you go out and listen to the Parkland, the Santa Fe, Texas, the Aztec, New Mexico's, the Saugus high schools, if you listen to those 911 calls, they are panicked. They're screaming or they're whispering because they're trying not to be detected by the shooter. They don't have accurate information. They don't really remember where they are in the building because that requires critical thinking. And so depending on 911 calls, even though it was great, they said they got over 100 911 calls, how accurate was that information? Did it give specific locations within the building? But more importantly, think of it this way. If there was a fire in a building, we've all been in those situations. We don't think to call 911. We only think, hey, it's now time to start protecting myself. Because the moment that alarm goes off, I know emergency responders are already being alerted, and I know everybody else in the building has been alerted as well. And so all I have to do is protect myself. You have to have systems in place in your building so that the teacher can put their finger down, activate a system, and then all they have to focus on is getting that door locked, getting that door barricaded, getting the lights out, or protecting their students. They should not have other obligations like trying to call the front office. In Oxford, it was great that they got over the PA system and told everybody to go into lockdown and everything like that. But once again, it was a very slow process in the sense of that took minutes. And that's something that needs to be happening in seconds. And that's what alarms do.
What was, that video that one of the students, I believe it was the student that filmed in that classroom where the kids were all in there. And, I know at first they said that they were reported that this was the shooter trying to get in the room. And then I saw yesterday where a report came out that said, no, we think it was actually a detective that was trying to get in. But what struck me on that is here's these kids barricaded in this room and they're listening, trying to figure out, is this guy for real or not? And when whoever it was on the outside, I think it was the detective. You know what video I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure because the kids did evacuate, and immediately there was they went back into a different building or an entrance, and there was immediately sheriff's deputies there telling them it was okay. So I'm pretty sure it was the detective in question.
But what was interesting is there's training because the kids, when they decided for sure that wasn't a real law enforcement officer, as the gentleman on the outside used the term bro.
Right.
In the videos. And all the kids go, he said bro, no cop would say bro. But these kids are thinking, and that, so the kid, my point of bringing this up is these young people are in there trying to make good decisions in the most horrible situation you can imagine for anybody to be put in. Defenseless, just a door is keeping them from a person coming in and doing harm to them. But they're still processing, they're still thinking, they're still trying, right? We got to give these kids the tools and the basic things necessary to help give them that fighting chance if they have to. But it struck me, I thought, man, because I would have thought the same thing. If I was in the room and I heard somebody on the other side say bro at the end, even as an adult, I would have said, that's not a police officer. I mean, I would have immediately thought that, So I think it says,
which comes down to
interesting.
Yeah, it comes down to a point, and I guess I would just talk to the administrators that are, are out there in their schools and understand that you still have a role once law enforcement shows up. Yes, it's a crime scene. Yes, they're going to be in charge, but there is no reason to immediately evacuate those classrooms until you can do it in a very controlled fashion. And so I instruct teachers all the time, like, if you have any doubts whatsoever, please don't open your door. The first thing you should do is call 911. Just take your phone and say, hold on, whoever's on the other side of the door, hold on. And you can just say, call dispatch and say, hey, I have someone who's outside my room. Is there any chance that this is an officer or whatever? And if they're, just say, hey, have the officer tell the dispatcher. The teacher should say, tell the dispatcher to say the word Jabberwocky or some code word that you make up right there on the spot. Right. And if they repeat it back, then you know that that's somebody with a radio. But more importantly is no detectives, and this is why the school administrators need to work and train with law enforcement, is you shouldn't be evacuating these classrooms in an uncontrolled fashion. You should literally get on the PA system, and we're going to be evacuating room 212. There's officers out front. Students, be ready. He's going to open the door. He has a key. When he comes, he's going to ask you to come out of the classroom. So then that way, the students who are traumatized, they shouldn't be seeing somebody walking through the door with a gun. They should be going outside and seeing 4 or 5 people in uniform and know that they're being protected, right? That they're going out there. And that's done over the PA system, and it's done nice and methodically, right? And that's how you alleviate that sort of stress and confusion that happened in that situation. The same thing happened in Parkland. We had some officers that were breaking windows and things like that. We just don't want that. The kids have been told and should know that responsible people have keys to the classroom and will come evacuate them in due time. So there's no exigency to get them out of that classroom.
Well, Doug, I'm going to put a bow on this today. I'm going to give you last words and just say for myself personally, I know SafeDefend would echo this. Our prayers are with the community in Michigan, with those kids, the parents, the folks that lost loved ones, administrators, everybody in that community. We're all praying for you guys. And Doug, I'll give you last word.
Yeah, so I just want to address something that came up. And first off, the Oxford School District did a great job training with their officers, and the staff knew what to do. They knew how to do the lockdowns. They knew how to do the barricades, and all of that's wonderful. And I think it's great. And the students weren't overly traumatized or anything like that. There's a New York Times article that came out today. It says, why do we do these drills? Because it doesn't prevent mass shootings. It's like, the purpose of a drill is not to prevent mass shootings. The purpose of these drills is to minimize casualties and let people know what they can do to be safe. This is what's so silly about that is saying that, oh, it's traumatic to talk about this. Well, you and I grew up in an era where we did stop, drop, and roll, or I grew up on an Air Force base, and so we did, duck and cover to survive nuclear attacks and things like that. And I'm not overly traumatized. No, I just thought it was the normal course of the day. But understand, we do fire drills because we know they work to help people safe. We do tornado drills because we know it keeps people safe. When you get on an airplane, they tell you where the exits are, knowing you're never going to use them. But they're still telling you to do that, to formulate that plan to keep yourself safe. So our kids are not overly traumatized. I've sent 3 of my own children through the school system. They know more about these drills than I do. I talk with them about it. I say, what's your plan? What's the teacher telling you to do? And the most important thing that a parent can do is, 1, talk to their kid about these type of things and say, 1, there are no jokes. If anybody makes a comment, we're going to report it. And I will support you 100%. No matter if you tell me or a staff member or a police officer about a complaint and something happens, I will support you because that's what I want. But more importantly, parents should never contradict the training of a teacher or a staff. If they say we're going to immediately go into barricade, an Idaho study that just came out showed that's the safest place for kids in an active shooter situation. But you can't tell your kid to run from that classroom while the teacher's trying to lock that door, because now all of a sudden I have one person trying to open it and another person trying to keep it closed. They need to work together. And the other side of a locked door is the safest place for kids in a school shooting. It doesn't mean you don't evacuate, but if you can't get behind a locked door, then you would. But barricading is probably your best bet in these situations.
Doug, we appreciate you guys, and thank you again for sharing your thoughts and your expertise today for everybody. And we just remind everybody, join us every Friday at 9:30 Central Time, and Doug and other members of SafeDefend family will be here to give advice, talk counsel, try to give you some ideas. And as always, if you have any questions, please just go to safedefend.com, give them a call, send them an email. They'll be glad to answer any questions you may have. So, Doug, thank you again. Have a beautiful day, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Phil. Enjoy.
All right, bud.